Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 14. Today we'll be talking about troubled times, the tumultuous 1850s. So we're getting really close to Civil War. Spoiler alert, next lecture is the Civil War. So this one we're going to look at 1850 to 1859. We're going to see what does the country do right before we go to war? What are the last minute band-aids that we put on to try and keep us from war? Oh, this didn't change from last time, so I apologize for that. So we're just going to launch into it. The first one's going to be political compromises. We're going to take it back a little bit. Remember, we talked about the Fugitive Slave Act. The first one is authorized by Congress in 1793, and it authorizes local governments to seize and return people who are escaped slaves back to their owners, and also imposes penalties on anyone who tries to help them to gain their freedom, either by hiding them or by actually helping them to escape their plantations. We're going to amend that. We're going to have a second one that's passed in 1850 that's going to compel all citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. And it will also deny enslaved people their right to a jury trial. So now you can't just say, oh, I had no idea. You are now compelled by the federal government to help turn in freed slaves, or even people that you suspect to be freed slaves. Not freed slaves, excuse me, escaped slaves, escaped slaves. It's also going to take away individual cases from federal, or it's going to put them into the hands of federal commissioners. So they are going to, it's essentially a bounty hunting system. They're going to create these federal commissioners who are going to, their job is to go around and find escaped slaves. And sometimes it's legitimate escaped slaves, and sometimes it's not. And it's not there's no recourse for someone who's captured by them. Essentially, they're not believed, they're not given any real rights or anything at this time. So we're really taking this to an extreme level now. And this second Fugitive Slave Act is just going to create more outrage from the North, primarily. And will just increase the amount of people helping and freeing slaves via the Underground Railroad during the 1850s. Northern states will also avoid enforcing the law, and by 1860, the number of runaways that were successfully returned to slaveholders hovered around just 100 and 330. So between a decade, only about 300 people were recaptured using the basis of this law. And both acts eventually will be repealed by Congress in 1864, but after the Civil War. And so it's something that'll push us closer and closer to war during the time. We also have the original compromise that actually instituted slavery here in the Constitution in 1787, and that's the 3/5 clause that states can count enslaved persons as 3/5 of a free person, but only for the purpose of determining population for representation. It also prevents the federal government from restricting or regulating the importation of slaves until at least 1808. So it really kicks the can way down the road here. Now, if you remember in 1820, we have our first compromise that is attempted to happen, the Missouri Compromise, and that's when Missouri and Maine will enter at the same time, with Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. They'll maintain that balance between free and slave states. And it just basically says that anything below this red line will be a slave state. Everything above it, with the exception of Missouri, will be a free state. And that's what we think will solve our problems for a while. And obviously it doesn't, because then we get to the Compromise of 1850. And what happens between 1820 and 1850? Well, if you look here, this land here is still under the control of Mexico and Spain. And this area here is still under control by Britain. 30 years later, we've got that entire territory. Everything we have here is now ours. And we've immediately added two new states in Texas and California. Now, the old rule will not work because it specifically says in that law, the Missouri Compromise, that it's just the territory gotten from the Louisiana Purchase. None of this extra territory was gotten from the Louisiana Purchase. So now we don't know what to do with this. And we've got two states. This is fine. We can add both of them because California wants to be a free state and Texas wants to be a slave state. So we're still maintaining that balance. But now we've got other ones that are starting to form. And what's going to happen with them? It's going to be Compromise of 1850 is going to be 5 separate bills that we all collectively refer to as the Compromise of 1850. And these are what it those 5 bills do. It permits slavery in Washington, D.C., but outlaws the slave trade. So it's okay, we can still have slaves here, but we cannot buy and sell slaves here. It adds California to the Union as a free state. It establishes Utah and New Mexico as territories that could decide via popular sovereignty if they would permit slavery. So Utah and New Mexico here, whenever they become a state, they have the right here to vote on it, to have a popular vote to decide if they'll be a free state or a slave state. It will also define new boundaries for the state of Texas following the Mexican-American War, remove its claims to parts of New Mexico, and award the state $10 million in compensation for taking land away from it. The Fugitive Slave Act is also in here. It requires citizens to assist in apprehending runaway slaves and denied enslaved people a right to a trial by jury. So all of those together are what our State of the Union is at this point. If we think about it as something that's like spreading apart, right? We start off really, really close, right? And as we go through 1820, we've like stopped here. 1850, we bring a little bit apart, and then we've got our compromises. And then what happens? We have the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, just 4 years after those big compromises that we went through. Many Southerners are very resentful of the Missouri Compromise because they think it should all be based on popular sovereignty. And why did they think that? Because they can pack the states with it. Not just Utah and New Mexico should have this ability to vote on whether they'll be a free or slave state. And so they're going to argue for their right to bring their enslaved property wherever they choose to, and that it still remain enslaved. By the 1850s, we're even starting to get some agitation and saying, yeah, it's okay to use violence against these slaveholders because they're being violent to other humans. That gives us the right to be violent towards them. And even among abolitionists, there are different attitudes towards slavery. Some want the West to be for poor white people, and they don't want slaves to enter over there because they think it'll compete and take things away from poor white people. The radical abolitionists want society of equality between Black and white people. So even within the people who want to get rid of slavery, there's varying degrees of lingering racism and the way that we want to actually come about with this. Others will oppose slavery in principle, but they don't want free enslaved people here. They want to send them over to that colony in Africa that we talked about last week. So there's lots going on here. And then in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is proposed. Now, why does this happen? It creates 2 territories, Kansas and Nebraska. So this is the rest of that undefined territory that we saw when we first got the Compromise of 1850. It's also going to apply the principle of popular sovereignty. It's going to say that it'll get rid of that Missouri Compromise line and just give them the same thing as well, right? Congress will pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and what happens is that the Democrats divide as a result of the bill, and there starts to be shakeup at the federal level between people who are in power. It also creates the Republican Party that was dedicated to preventing the spread of slavery into the territory. So we get branching off of people, of politicians, and we get a rearrangement of these political parties. The Republican Party will become a solidly northern political organization after this. And following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the political system will be deeply polarized for the first time in history. It might seem pretty normal to us that we have 2 parties who are very much opposed to each other and can't get anything done. This is the first time that we see that happen in American history up to this point. And what happens next is Bleeding Kansas, 1855 to 1856. Because we launched that Kansas-Nebraska Act, because we say, yeah, they can have popular sovereignty, they can decide their own which ones they're going to be, both the North and the South do not want to risk it coming in as the other one and losing some of their power in the federal government. And so both pro and anti-slavery activists are going to start just flooding into Kansas. They're just going to start heading there, setting up, living there, so that eventually they can vote one way or the other for whether it'll be a slave state or not. Pro-slavery people who are from Missouri are going to cross the border to vote in Kansas, and they will gain advantage. And so what happens is they'll use fraud and illegal vote counting to make Kansas a slave state. And so a pro-slavery legislature will be created, and it'll create the Lecompton Constitution. but the majority of actual Kansans were anti-slavery. And so many of those are coming from New England to get some of this property that they could get. And they wanted anti-slavery, but we don't get to have that, right? And so what happens is there's this huge, huge blowout fight between pro and anti-slavery people in Kansas leading up to this election. But ultimately, the pro-slave people will win in Kansas here. We also have the Dred Scott case that occurs in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave born in Virginia in 1795. He's bought and moved to Missouri, which is a slave state. And then his owner will take him first to Illinois and then to the Wisconsin Territory, both part of the Northwest Territory, both where slavery is forbidden. So because of that, when he comes back to Missouri, he's going to attempt to buy his freedom, but his owner will refuse. So he'll take his case to the state courts. And he's going to argue that because he was taken to and lived in areas that are free states, that he should be free, because as soon as he, as a slave, was brought to those locations, it was null and void. So the jury initially is going to agree with him, and they'll say that him, his wife, and his children are free. His owner is going to appeal that to the state Supreme Court, which will argue will side with the owner, and then Scott will appeal again. And when he appeals again, he'll go to the Supreme Court, and they'll issue their statement in 1857, which will say, if he was on the question of whether Scott was free, the Supreme Court decides he remains enslaved. They'll say that when it doesn't matter if you go beyond, a slave state or not, you're still a slave. Now they'll go further beyond that question and actually specifically say that that the court shouldn't even have been considering this case, because Black people could never be citizens of the United States, and therefore that they could not appeal they didn't have rights as a citizen, so which means that they could not sue, they could not appeal their cases, and they should not have made it all the way to the Supreme Court. It'll also rule that Congress has no authority to stop or limit the spread of slavery in the American territories. And so this is a very explicit pro-slavery ruling that will then make the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional and make popular sovereignty unconstitutional, which will just anger the Republicans in the North and show to them further proof of the reach of Southern slave power. The decision also complicates life for Northern Democrats. They can no longer use popular sovereignty as like a example for the Southerners, right? It's gone now. They've been told they can't use it. It's unconstitutional. And so while all this is happening, we have a huge increase in the use of the Underground Railroad, which is not a physical railroad, but a series of trails that are to get enslaved people out of the South and off of their plantations, either to the north and then into Canada, or out to the islands, or down into Mexico. Of course, Harriet Tubman here is one of the most famous person associated with the Underground Railroad. She she helps hundreds of slaves to escape and kept going back into the South to get more. She was always trying to get the most people that she could out of it. And so because of the Fugitive Slave Act, because of popular sovereignty, because of Bleeding Kansas, we have so many people who think that their only choice, and realistically their only choice, was to just flee, to just run away and to escape. And they weren't truly free or safe until they got out of the country. But not every slave made it or wanted to make it out of the country. So a lot of them will resettle in the North here. John Brown and Harper's Ferry. John Brown is a radical abolitionist. In 1859, he and 18 men, both Black and white, will attack the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. They're going to try and capture the weapons and distribute it among the enslaved people, and they want to lead this huge slave rebellion that'll just end slavery. And he has no patience for nonviolent approach. He does not want to be peaceful anymore. To John Brown, Slavery appears an unacceptable evil that must be purged from the land, and he believed in using the sword to defeat the ungodly. They're going to easily take control of that federal armory because it was unguarded, but ultimately they won't get much further than that. Very few enslaved people will actually rally to him and try to fight. They're more concerned with staying alive than they are with rebelling from their slave keepers. And so he'll eventually get holed up in a part of town with him and his men getting shots taken out from them by the townspeople and the other militias. Eventually, federal troops commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, we'll see him again in the next lecture, they'll capture Brown and his followers, and on December 2nd of 1859, Brown will be hanged by the state of Virginia for treason. So you can see we're barely hanging on as a country, right? We've got so many things going on related to slavery. And then to put the cherry on top and really fully rip us apart, Abe Lincoln is elected. So Abe Lincoln comes onto the scene during the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. Him and Stephen Douglas are going to draw huge crowds to listen to them talk and argue specifically about slavery and its expansion. Their speeches will be published all over the country in various newspapers. Stephen Douglas was already a senator, so he had some wide national recognition, but Lincoln was really not known before these debates. And so Douglas is going to portray the Republican Party as an abolitionist effort that wanted race mixing through sexual relations or marriage. He's a Democrat who's going to say, this is terrible. This is the worst thing that you could possibly imagine. Republicans want us to live with, be equal to, and marry Black people. The Black Republicans that Douglas declared posed a dangerous threat to the Constitution, but Lincoln will say, quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." So Lincoln's going to interpret that Dred Scott decision in the Kansas-Nebraska Act as efforts to nationalize slavery and make it legal everywhere from New England to the Midwest and beyond. And he won't really take a stand and say he is pro-slavery or he is anti-slavery. He's just going to say, hey, we can keep doing both. We got to pick one, and that's what it's going to be. And so it's very interesting in his debates here that we see that come through. So he's elected ultimately to the presidency in 1860. He will get only 40% of the popular vote. He will win every northern state except for New Jersey. And in many southern states, Lincoln's name will not even appear or be allowed to be on the ballots. So many Southerners won't even have the choice to vote for Lincoln. He will gain a majority in the Electoral College, but Southern radicals are not happy that he is elected. And immediately after declaring the election results, South Carolina will lead the charge and become the first Southern state to secede from the Union. And their reason, because Lincoln was elected. And that's what we'll leave it for today. You'll see we got all the way up to 1860. We're going to pick it up with the next lecture, 1860 to 1865. That'll take us through the whole of the Civil War. The textbook goes into a lot more detail, especially about Harper's Ferry and Bleeding Kansas, so make sure that you read up on those. Other than that, that'll be the end of this lecture. And if you have any questions, as always, pop them into the question forum or send me an email, and I will see you guys back here for the next lecture.